Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversation. Our subject today is Latin America. Where have we been in our foreign policy and where are we headed? In the shuffle of the US election, Latin America may have been swept under the rug, but we have 76 million Americans who voted for Joe Biden, 71 million for Donald Trump. Strangely, although 2/3 of the Latino community voted for Biden, Trump did much better in South Florida and Southeast Texas than he did 4 years ago. What explains this? How does it impact our attitude toward Latin America? Our guest will tell us. She is Shannon O'Neil. Shannon O'Neil is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and an expert on Latin American affairs. We're delighted to welcome Shannon O'Neil back to the program.
Great to be joining you.
Well, it's wonderful to see you. Now, let me ask you, what is the explanation? Why did Trump do better with Latinos when he referred to Mexicans as rapists and murderers and referred to a country in Central America as a shithole country?
Well, there are a lot of reasons, and one of the main ones is that Latinos are a really disparate group. There are Mexican Americans, there are Guatemalan Americans, but there are Venezuelan Americans, Colombian Americans, Cuban Americans. There's a lot of different groups. And when you look especially at South Florida, where he was quite strong, that's a different group of people, right? Those are Venezuelans, ex-Venezuelans, ex-Colombians, ex-Cubans, or the descendants of those different groups. And they tend to be much more hawkish on foreign policy. The Trump campaign was quite adept at running lots of ads that Joe Biden was going to be a socialist. He was going to be like Hugo Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, or he was going to be like the Castros in Cuba. And so it played to their worries about the strongmen in Latin America, that so many they or their parents or even grandparents had fled, that was going to come here to the United States. Now, not saying that's true, of course, but campaigns are campaigns. And so he was very successful on that side. And then I would say with the Southern Texans, which are more Mexican Americans than say other nationalities, while there is a difference, and Donald Trump has said all those things about Mexicans that you just mentioned, there are demographic and cultural and other reasons that he appealed to some of those people. Many of these people are very religious and pro-life. Many of them live in rural areas. Many of them have some of the same concerns that their rural white neighbors care about as well, in terms of impressions of healthcare, impressions of the role of the government in society, impressions of the right to bear arms, and all those sorts of things that led people to vote for Trump. Many Mexican Americans in those particular parts of the country lean that way as well.
Are many of them members of law enforcement or ICE agents, and who naturally would gravitate toward Trump?
That's a big part too, right? A lot of these people have either they themselves or members of their families are part of Customs and Border Protection or other parts of the US government in these places, and so do lean that way along with their unions.
So other than these ideological issues, has Trump really done anything for the Latino community?
Well, this is a big question, right? Has he done much? Obviously on the rhetorical side has not been that supportive. For Latino communities where immigration is a big concern, for the dreamers, for those who were brought here as kids and then have grown up in the United States and don't know their homeland that they came from, he has not been supportive of that demographic, which is several 100,000, if not 1 million strong. For the families that are here, there's some 5 million families here where the kids are US citizens, but one or both of the parents are not, and some don't have papers at all. He has done nothing for those people, right? But like many people who have voted for Trump, who want to change in the system, who feel that America is increasingly unequal or they don't have a chance, I think that is where he has appealed. And, I'll leave it to you and others to decide if Trump has done anything in these 4 years to help that group of people.
It's interesting that since the election, there have been ads on social media targeting the Latino community. Ads that are headed robbed, in which they argue that somehow or other the Democrats stole the election. Now, what does he hope to accomplish? He won Texas and he won Florida.
This is a question, right? Because you think about the Latino communities that are in the states that are in play. You have Pennsylvania, you have Nevada, which is a strong Mexican-American community that turned out very strongly for Biden. Arizona, too, has lots of Latinos. Now, some of those, particularly in the southern part of the state, are very affiliated with Border Patrol or very involved in that. So there are divides and there are different political leanings within this overall population.
Now, let's turn to COVID, which is foremost on everyone's mind. Perhaps you could comment on how COVID has affected the Latino community and has it affected their political leanings, and also what has happened in South America with COVID. Do they have a better record than we do, or are they seeing a resurgence of the pandemic?
Well, here in the United States, there are a good percentage of Latinos who work in essential industries, so have been on the front line. So either they have been working in grocery stores, working in delivery, working in all kinds of areas in healthcare and the like. So it has been a community that's been strongly affected. You also see a lot of Latinos in different places work in industries that have been hit hardest. So especially the hospitality and tourism industry, right? The restaurants and the hotels and other resorts and the like have been hit hard. So it has been, COVID has hit this population incredibly hard economically. And we've also seen in real health consequences where a lot of people who have gotten COVID have come from this population. So I think it is a huge concern in this broader community, with the caveat this community is such a dispersed and disparate group. Latinos are not just one big group, but are very separate in terms of all kinds of demographics and backgrounds and socioeconomic levels and beliefs and all of that. One thing that is true is when you look south of our border and you get out of the United States, that the Western Hemisphere has not done particularly well compared to the rest of the world. And Latin America, Mexico, Central America, and South America, this is an area of the world that has been hit hardest. And the pandemic continues to rage throughout the region. And really, it hasn't mattered what kind of policies the governments have put in. We have some governments in the hemisphere, Argentina being the most restrictive, put in the most restrictive policies in terms of months and months long lockdown. And they have over 1 million cases. You have other countries like Mexico and Brazil, whose leaders don't even register that COVID is much more than a flu. And they too have seen a huge outpouring of cases and unfortunate deaths.
Well, Brazil has reportedly 137,000 deaths, which is second only to the record in the United States of America, where we have upwards of 237,000. And its leader, Bolsonaro, has taken a cavalier attitude toward COVID, hasn't he? Comparable to that of Trump. I mean, he has refused to wear a mask and he contracted COVID just the way Trump did.
He did. So there's a lot of similarities there between the two in many different ways, but particularly with COVID, where both leaders contracted the disease, both recovered, and both seem to think now that it's not really a big deal for the population. So we're not seeing, same thing in Brazil, you're seeing state level governments, governors, try to doing different responses. So some governors really try to take this seriously and put in place the kinds of public health measures that would reduce it, and others following the president in his lead in not wearing masks and not doing the kinds of things that public health experts would recommend all of us do.
Now, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or perhaps even before, maybe it goes back to Woodrow Wilson, the United States established a good neighbor policy toward Latin America, which the principal elements of which, if I remember from high school history, were non-intervention in their affairs and reciprocal trade agreements. Now, have we followed a good neighbor policy toward Latin American countries in the last 4 years?
You know, we have seen under the Trump administration a real pullback in interest in the region and a change in tone. So the pullback is that there hasn't been a lot of interest in the region. The things like trade, we don't see a lot of trade agreements because that's not what this president is all that interested in. And in sort of thinking about big, broad trade agreements, that's not been a hallmark of the Trump administration. Little deals here and there, yes, but not bigger agreements. So that has not been a leading factor. You know, another thing that has permeated U.S. Latin America relations for years has been a focus on democracy and supporting democracy in the region. And that has not been a hallmark of this administration, the Trump administration. There has been a focus on Venezuela, which we can talk more about, but overall, we have not been all that interested in the nuts and bolts of democratic checks and balances and autonomy and free and fair elections and the kinds of thing that really guided policy for many years. We've been less interested, I would say, on security issues, right? There's a long history of fighting drug trafficking, but looking at citizen security more broadly in Latin America. And this is a region that unfortunately has less than 10% of the world's population, but about a third of all of the murders in the world. And so it is a very violent region, and past governments, both Republican and Democrat, have tried to work with governments around the region to lower that, to improve citizen security, to improve the rule of law, to go after corruption. There have been a lot of programs, and many of those programs have stalled or stopped in the last 4 years. So there really has been a pullback from the region. And the other big change that we have seen is relationships have gotten more transactional. So we have seen a lot of back and forth, for instance, with Mexico. If you stop migrants from coming up to the United States, then we won't put tariffs on you, right? We saw the president pull back aid to Central America because migrants were leaving. So they were forcing these governments to stop migrants and take migrants back in order to continue to get US aid. So that's a very different kind of approach than you saw under either a George W. Bush or a Barack Obama or those before, our most recent presidents. So I think there has been a big shift in these last 4 years. And the real question is now what happens with the new administration coming in? Will we see a return to the old, or what will the path forward look like?
Well, was it particularly effective to use trade agreements as leverage in order to accomplish a reduction in migrant immigration?
So we have seen the numbers fall precipitously, particularly a year or two ago when Mexico came to the table and redirected its National Guard, a new National Guard formed for security issues, to stop migrants, particularly Central American migrants. But what we have actually seen since May of this year is a slow increase in the number of people coming again to the US southern border. So while it may have delayed the flows of people, it hasn't stopped them. And when you look at the bigger things that are happening, you look at COVID and the huge economic costs that it has, these countries are weathering because of the shutdowns and because of the disease itself. When we look forward to the next administration, I do think we are going to see a huge uptick in migration. And it's because of desperation, it's because of need, it's because violence continues, it's because all of the push factors that led people to leave are continuing. And the other big migration that's happening in the hemisphere that hasn't really touched the United States as much as one might think is from Venezuela. And there we have an authoritarian government. We have a huge humanitarian crisis. We have almost everyone in the country living in poverty, most people not getting enough of their daily calories and food because of just the tragedy of an economy that's half its size for that was a decade ago, and 5+ million people who have fled that country and more that will come. Most of those have been absorbed within Latin America, some in Europe, less in the United States, but I do think as more people leave, we will see more of those people come our direction as well.
Well, you spoke of narcotics and murders in the region, but they particularly centered on Venezuela, where there have been government-sponsored extrajudicial murders, and there's been traffic in narcotics, indeed narco-terrorism. We've indicted Mr. Maduro for being a narco-terrorist. We're probably not going to get him in the United States, but the Justice Department is on record with respect to that matter. Anyway, and Trump appointed Elliot Abrams as special representative on Venezuela, and he's talked about democracy and he's talked about regime change, and there's been a lot of jawboning and support for the opposition. Is there much more that Trump could have done other short of invasion in order to get rid of Maduro and put in a democratically elected regime?
I think the challenge in Venezuela, it is a huge challenge, and it shows how hard it is to lead to regime change. How do you change a regime if you're not willing to take a military intervention, which no one in the United States is willing to take, and is not, we've been down that path before, and it's unlikely that we'll do it again or any time in the near future. But it shows how hard it is to do. And it shows, though, different paths. The United States chose to go in a very forceful, vitriolic, grandiose path, supporting an opposition, not recognizing anymore the Maduro government, recognizing a de jure, if not de facto government led by Juan Guaido, who was the head of the National Assembly, elected the head of the National Assembly. But in the end, that wasn't enough to dislodge a kleptocratic, repressive government. And one thing that we didn't do all that well along the way was bring along the rest of our allies. And so the pressure became increasingly unilateral from the United States rather than multilateral. And there are a lot of people. When Juan Guaido came in as head of the National Assembly, we saw Europeans, we saw lots of Latin American countries, many people join in to support some sort of regime change. So as I look at what is a huge quandary and really shows the limits of the ability to fundamentally transform another society in another country, one thing that a next administration could try is to go back to that multilateral approach, to go back to bringing together dozens of nations to try to put pressure on the regime. But it's going to be a difficult path on the way forward, and the Venezuelans in the end will be those that suffer.
Well, we're learning more and more how difficult it is to remove a kleptocratic autocracy in the government, but maybe time will tell. Let's go to Mexico. Obrador is the leader, replaced Peña Nieto, who certainly didn't get along well with Trump. Obrador thought he had a better relationship. But Obrador has yet to congratulate Biden on winning the election. I mean, what do you make of that?
It is odd. He's one of the only countries in the hemisphere and even around the world. So joining, the Vladimir Putins in the world with not recognizing Biden victory. He says it's to wait till the legal process plays out. I think it's in part the Mexican officials equating our system with their system, which is very different. Their system has an electoral court. It has an electoral body that's a national one that oversees elections for president. And we don't have that. Each state does these things on its own. And so I think it's not quite understanding the US system and how this works. But I think it was a missed opportunity, frankly, for López Obrador and his government to get off on a good footing with the United States, to get off on a good footing with their largest trading partner, the place where millions of their citizens live or come and go every day across the border, a place where so many things, their communities, their security, their environmental ties, their water ties. There's all these issues that we have on the agenda between the two countries, given proximity and given the long history together. And it's too bad that he hasn't joined in with so many others around the world to congratulate the new president-elect.
Well, we assume that the president-elect Biden has a thicker skin than the president does, and relations will get off, at least at the beginning, on a good footing. But what would you recommend that Biden do other than appointing Shannon O'Neil, the Assistant Secretary for Latin American Affairs?
No. I think the biggest change that will happen, whether someone congratulates you or not, is that we will see a return to much more institutional foreign policy. This is not foreign policy that's just going to be run out of the West Wing. It's not foreign policy that's going to be done by tweets. It's going to be foreign policy that is done across the State Department, but all of the other departments, and particularly in the case of Mexico, where, in the US Embassy in Mexico, there are dozens of agencies that have representatives. Those people are going to be empowered again to do their jobs, to find their counterparts within the Mexican government. So whether it's, the FDA or the Department of Agriculture or the DEA or security or the Customs and Border Patrol or all sorts of, or the Environmental Protection Agency, all of these people have an interest. All the agencies and departments have a role to play because so much of this goes back and forth across the border and are tied together. So I do think the biggest shift is going to be an institutionalization of the relationship. And so that takes the hard feelings, whether they're there or not, out of the picture, right? It's back to real issues. But I think there will be a big change in the administration in different ways. We're going to have a Biden administration that cares a lot about commerce, of course. They're going to care a lot about labor rights. And in fact, the new US-Mexico-Canadian agreement, the USMCA, that came into force in July this year. That has a whole new labor chapter that Mexico agreed to, that all three countries agreed to. So I think there's going to be a real interest in enforcing worker rights down there. The other big issue that will be on the table, which hasn't been there for a while, are environmental issues. We know that from Biden and his campaign and those around him, that he's going to care about those issues both domestically in the United States, but in his foreign policy. So that's something that will be new and added to the U.S.-Mexico relationship as they go forward, as well as all the other issues that have been, for a long time on the table. But the good thing is Biden knows the region very well. He spent lots of time in Mexico, Central America, and all of South America when he was vice president, when he was a senator, and he has a good team of people around him. So I think we will see, a lot of added efforts and a lot of back and forth between the governments as we go forward.
Does it make sense to approach Latin American policy on a hemispheric basis or on a country by country basis, or perhaps both?
I think there's place for both, right? So the Goldilocks, if you do a little bit of both, but, in many of these areas, there are real bilateral issues. And that's why our system is set up the way it is, right? We have ambassadors in each country. We have others who liaison with Washington to really make sure that what's important in the bilateral relationship is there. But Latin America is a very diverse place. There's lots of different problems that are happening there. But I do think actually as we go forward, some of these bigger themes can be dealt with in a regional way. We have a whole hemisphere that has suffered greatly from COVID, and there's a lot of building back that will be need to done, both in terms of economies, in terms of health systems, in terms of the overall government structures to bring back some of these places and allow governments to respond to their voters throughout the region. We have security issues that also permeate the region. When you look at the flow of drugs, it's not just in one country, it goes across borders. And I think that's something that all governments need to work together for. And I think there's a real opportunity in the region on the trade and commerce side. As we see global supply chains and things moving around, we see sort of changes in other parts of the world. I think there is an opportunity here for the United States, but for the nations in the region, for everyone to win in sort of boosting manufacturing, boosting the kind of economic activity that's happening here in this hemisphere. And that can be a bilateral, but it can also be sort of a broader regional focus. So we'll see where it goes.
Okay, so quickly, perhaps we could take two countries together, Argentina and Chile. Argentina, Fernandez did congratulate the president-elect, but anything new going on in Argentina and Chile, and what should be the way forward there?
I don't know if Argentina and Chile want to be grouped together, but happy to talk about the two of them.
Well, for purposes of this program, we'll do it.
Exactly. There are interesting things. So Argentina has had just completed renegotiating its debt with its private sector debtors, but it has a huge, almost $50 billion debt with the IMF that it needs to renegotiate. And that will involve the United States. We're the biggest stakeholder there. We have a significant voting heft within the IMF. And so there's a real role there for the US and Argentina to work together to come to some sort of agreement on the economic path forward that will be sustainable. So I think that will be the biggest issue on the agenda there, even as the country tries to deal with a really difficult COVID situation within that nation. And then, Chile is quite interesting because we're seeing Chile just voted to create a constituent assembly to create a new constitution. So a year plus ago, we saw huge demonstrations with 1 million people pouring into Santiago. This is a country with less than 20 million people, but really wanting change, really wanting to change the structures of that country for lots of reasons. And they voted through a very democratic process to go forward there. So I think that's something the US should applaud, is them doing this in a very systematic and democratic way, and support where there's a space for support as they go through in this process. And there's a president who's entering his last year who will guide that, and then a new president a year plus from now who will continue that process. So I think that's something the US can be supporter from the outside, but perhaps also as it moves forward, allow that to continue.
Okay, so I have a question for you. And the question is, what would you do in the first 100 days if you were the president-elect to repair or enhance our relationship with Latin America?
So the things that are the biggest concerns for the hemisphere today, I would say, are migration, and so many people moving around, and how can the US facilitate both the just state of those people who are desperate and on the move, as well as begin to address the root causes that might allow them to make a decision to stay. And that's something we haven't been doing for 4 years, and I think we should get back in the game of doing. That's important. And then the other agenda that I would pick back up that also has languished is the anti-corruption agenda. Latin Americans have voted consistently to vote out corrupt people. They would like to have a more just and equal and equitable rule of law in their societies. And I think that's something that the United States should get behind as well. So those are the two things I would put on the agenda to kick off those first 100 days.
So migration and corruption. Shannon O'Neil, thank you so much for coming by. This has been marvelous. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. In the meantime, be well, stay safe, and all the best.